Do you buy into the notion of consilience, that all truth reconciles?
This is really fun now. I think that now I think I can agree with you more than before. I think I can, because now I can sort of see that, yes, the higher order stuff does have to be conciliant. But of course, the bounded rationalities of a given civilization, society, or even gender, right? That what's rational for a woman to do in a date versus a man is different. Those rationalities are obviously not necessarily going to be conciliant. And all of that deeply troubles and disturbs me. So I would say the enemy that I see to especially those who are vulnerable amongst us, cognitively vulnerable, let's say, and therefore, you know, the rest of society, because we're all interlinked. The enemy is the thing that takes that principle that you and I care so much about, which is this, again, this fundamental rationality, whatever it is, and just throws that in the trash can. That's my enemy. That's what really concerns me.
The things that impede one's ability to find truth.
Yeah.
The things that tamper down on the possibility of corrective mechanisms emerging in a society or a culture.
That's my enemy.
I think that should give us courage, exposure to other people's perspectives.
It's moving us in a good direction.
I'm here with Wael Taji Miller. What brings you to be seated in this chair today?
Well, Peter, today I'm here in Budapest, as I have been for 3 years now, and I'm a doctoral candidate in neuroscience at Semmelweis University in the Faculty of Medicine. And I'm also a visiting fellow at the MCC, where I teach and lecture on psychology and social and cultural evolution, often with respect to technology and technological change.
So what do you mean by social and cultural evolution? What do you mean by that?
Well, it depends on how far back you want to go in the sort of history of this field. I mean, cultural evolution theory, when you think about it today, it's usually associated with a few key figures, I would say. People like, for example, Joseph Henrich, Joe Henrich, who is the, I believe, founder and still head of the Human Evolutionary Biology Department at Harvard University, although I believe he should still be there. And also Alex Messaoudi, who is I don't know him. I believe he's Canadian, but he is a fantastic professor who's done a lot of excellent work on the cultural evolution of technology and science. And then there are some other names like Michael Muthakrishna, who was at the LSE, who has worked with Henrich on like the cultural brain hypothesis to sort of attempt to quantify and theorize rather about various aspects of how human development on the group level relates to human development on the individual level, and what that means for societies and what it produces as a process.
So what do you mean by social and cultural evolution? What does that mean?
So essentially what I would say is that there tends to be a sort of phenomenon where people in the sort of social sciences, or maybe let's just say the human-focused sciences, maybe borrow terminology from physics or sometimes biology. So for instance, you see this with entropy. You have now a lot of psychologists who are doing research on trauma, right? And they'll borrow this kind of lexicon. So J.W. Pennebaker is one. He's the one who did the research with Jordan Peterson actually on trauma from big events like 9/11, stuff like that. And he has this term, sort of psychological entropy, to refer to, you know, the decay in confidence in sort of a belief system or fundamental axioms about the world. But with regards to social and cultural evolution, it goes way back further than that. I mean, even Darwin in The Origin of Species was speculating about what his sort of theory, which he's very tentative about, you know, even in the original text, if you read it, he's very tentative about, you know, what this might mean for humans and human societies. But already you see foreshadowings of that there. And then going on over the next 100 years, I think the biggest thing that got us to modern cultural and social evolution theory would be the sociobiology controversy, which starts with E.O. Wilson and his aforementioned book, Sociobiology, which was really vociferously opposed by thinkers like, for example, Stephen Jay Gould. Although paradoxically, social and cultural evolution theory doesn't really work without Gould. So let me step back and I'll explain what I mean. So evolution is seen by most people as, you know, maybe it's this exponential thing that societies, and I'm talking about social evolution here, so societies, cultures, they just get better and better and better and more advanced. And there's this great meme online that I use to illustrate this type of thinking. It's a meme or graph that many viewers will be familiar with. It shows like, you know, the Bronze Age, and then, you know, the Greeks, and then the Romans, and it's getting better. And then it's like, this is the hole left by the Christian Dark Ages or something. But then now it picks back up and we're exponentially growing again. But that's not really how change happens. So Gould's great contribution to this was in his discovery or work with, I believe, Richard J. Eldridge on punctuated equilibria, which is to say, and this also explains a lot of stuff in the fossil record as well. So I'm talking about biology and society interchangeably, really, because if you're an evolutionist, then society has to be a biological thing, at least in part. And in this punctuated equilibrium model, you have these periods of stasis followed by periods of rapid change. And then stasis followed by rapid change. And that's basically how it's been, I would say, for most, if not all of human history. The thing is that now with, everyone loves to talk about AI. But in all seriousness, I think it's fair to say that we are now in a period of like rapid change. We don't really know how long that's going to go. And the impact on that for the stability and integrity of our social system is something that I'm very interested in and that I'm lecturing on at the MCC and at other places.
So when you say, can you give us some examples of cultural, well, is there a difference between cultural and social evolution?
Yeah, I would say that there has to be. So for instance, like social change can happen on the level of organization that is below the culture. You know, and I'm a little bit skeptical now on some of these differentiations that we use. So for example, we say civilization, then culture, then society, then family, then individual, or whatever. We have these sort of gradated units. And I think that that's a good model. I'm not sure exactly how intelligible it is when you like put a microscope to it. But you could have, for instance, a cultural change that then has ramifications for the different sort of micro-societies underneath that culture. So for instance, in the United States, you might have sort of a macro cultural change, right? Which is all Americans. But then, this affects Black Americans and white Americans differently, for instance. Or in Hungary, you might have something that happens on the collective cultural level, which then affects these micro-societies like, the various different urban communities, people in Miskolc compared to people in Debrecen compared to people in Budapest. It affects them differently. But one of the things that's happening right now, thanks to technology, is that these cultures, these micro-societies are kind of disappearing under the impact of technology-driven homogenization. So I think you could basically say, for instance, if you look at the United States even, Generation Z Americans are less differentiated than ever before by accent and dialect. Yeah. Right? You have people who are from like North Carolina speaking exactly like people who are from the West or East Coast. And this is a trend that is happening here in Hungary as well. You have regional accents disappearing. Hungary is a country that never really had many strong dialects because, not because of its size, but because in the 1800s, during the Age of Revolutions, there was a lot of people moving around and stuff. And so the accents, the dialects got kind of leveled out. But in the United States, you do see this. So we're becoming increasingly homogenized, and of course, it's having effects on our minds and our societies.
Yeah, and you see that when you go to Australia, for example, the same Americanisms through homogeneity.
Oh yeah, like
TV.
Hungarian Zoomers, I would say, are less Hungarian in a sense than their parents were. Right? They're becoming more Americanized and just more American flat out. Like I was teaching a class, an academy. Last weekend, and there was a kid there who was from this generation who just spoke with a flawless American accent. And of course, during the lecture I was teaching, he was just on his phone constantly all the time. And so I could sort of make that connection and be like, yeah, you probably watch a lot of Twitch streamers. You probably are, being drawn into what some people call the globo-homo culture, if you want to call it that. And, there's a lot of conservative commentators who would criticize this and, say this and that about it. And I think there's a valuable place for that. But I'm more interested in looking at all of this change from a sort of evolutionary perspective and see, whether it amounts to genuine progress or not.
Okay, so real quick, so I can just discharge this from my mind. One of the things that upsets me or deeply concerns me about the coming AI revolution is that the United States will lose its soft power. People will be able to create movies. They won't rely on Hollywood. They won't rely on our film and TV industry. I'll just put that out there for a second. But
I'd love to respond to that,
Yeah, go ahead then.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. But I think that when you look at this from the other side, okay, let's look at this from the Hungarian perspective for a second. Why did the United States win the Cold War? Right. Well, the United States won the Cold War for a lot of things, but if you've ever heard of or played a video game called Civilization 5, when you play this game, and you get to the cultural victory screen. It says, congratulations, everyone is now listening to your pop music and wearing your blue jeans, right? And so it sort of amounts to that. Hungarians, after the 1990s, started listening to your pop music and wearing your blue jeans. And yes, that is a successful example of the application of American soft power. On the other hand, what does that mean for cultural sovereignty? And actually, I think if you don't mind, we can go a little deeper into this, because this is something that relates to social and cultural evolution. So one of the things about social and cultural evolution is that it happens if the organism is just left alone, right? Because there are natural changes that are incremental in the environment over time. These can be climatic changes, these can be behavioral changes, or they can be any sort of change driven by, for instance, a new technology. So let me give you an example of that. So when you have the printing press, for example, you have Germans first, then later Hungarians being able to express themselves in their own way. And this act of self-expression is, if you think about it, it's a change of the environmental conditions. We humans, we're master social niche constructors, right? We create our own niches and then we evolve them over time. We're constantly, we identify problems, we solve those problems. By solving that problem, you have now changed the operating environment for your society, right?
Correct.
And so for hundreds of years, even under terrible conditions of, for example, Islamic occupation, let us not forget that where we're sitting right now, right now, this city, this room, this was part of an Islamic state that waged an aggressive jihad against the country. It had a caliph, it was a khilafah, it was a caliphate. And even under those conditions, Hungarians were able to maintain their self-expression until now, right? Because now we're listening to your pop music, we're wearing your blue jeans. And that sort of autonomous development has actually been taken away, I would say, from Hungarians. So when we come back now to your question, I apologize, I often take long circles in my answers.
No, you're fine.
But coming back to your original point or question about the implications of this for American soft power, I would say absolutely yes, but I like that, right? And I don't like that because I'm anti-American. I'm certainly not anti-American. I'm a proud American citizen. I was born there. You know, it's my country as much as it is anyone else's, but who is a citizen. But I do believe that with AI, like I would like to see what Hungarians create for themselves out of that, you know?
So I'm thinking about this problem of cultural sovereignty, specifically the withering or the erosion of cultural sovereignty. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about this mimetically, thinking about it in terms of memeplexes.
Mimesis.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm thinking about this in terms of the ideas that spread most, that are more likely to diminish sovereignty. Those are the memes that are quote unquote sticky. Mm-hmm. So how does that play into the way that you conceptualize the issue?
Could you give me an example of such an idea, please, that comes to mind when you think about this? The sticky ones.
All men are created equal, blue jeans, religion, Christianity, mm-hmm. McDonald's is a kind of memeplex in capitalism.
Sure. Okay, so those are some interesting examples, because the stickiness of religion, and I'm a scientist, so I want to not go too far outside my wheelhouse. There are people who can talk about immigration all day long and can do it much better than me, who are much better prepared with statistics and associated information that you would need. However, I do think that the stickiness of religion is something that we in Europe are really just beginning to kind of rediscover or discover in a way, principally as a result of the influx, or which some people call an invasion, of large numbers of Islamic migrants who do not express or display any desire to assimilate. And then it's like, okay, well, why are they not assimilating? And it turns out, well, probably the reason is that our culture is, at least implicitly, and I know you may have disagreements with this, but this is my position, at least implicitly Christian. Certainly from its genesis.
I don't disagree with it at all.
Yeah. And so what I would say is that, you know, in order to become European, there is a sense in which one has to accept the primacy of Christianity, at least in a historical sense, right? Because, you know, a culture is, you know, who we are, our shared origins, whether those be genetic, whether those be cultural, mimetic, social, historical, could be any number of things, right? But it's that history, and then it's where we are now, it's where we're going, right? It's our destiny. And what you have in Europe right now, and this is a response to your point about stickiness, is that these kind of sticky memes, specifically like Islam is what I'm thinking of in this instance.
Yeah, I was thinking of that too, yeah.
It's something that I think forces us to rethink the whole question of like assimilation per se. Because if you're like, okay, well, you have to assimilate into our culture and you don't really understand what question it is you're asking, then you need to be asking a new set of questions. And I don't want to go into all of that stuff about remigration or deportation. I'm not interested in solutions. As a scientist, I just point out problems to people to annoy them.
And so, what is the? Does it seem to you, because I certainly have an answer to this, that Islam is a stickier meme than Christianity?
I love that question, and I would say that it absolutely is stickier.
I agree.
But then why? Right?
Yeah, that's the question.
Well, I think that's a very easy question to answer.
Please.
Because if you look at Islam, like Islam itself comes from this four basic, there's the 5 pillars of Islam. But I mean, you have the Quran, which is in the Islamic context, this is the infallible word of God. So, there was an interesting debate early in Islamic history between the Asharis and the Mu'tazila, who were 2 different schools who had this problem with like, what is the Quran? What's the nature of the Quran? And it's very interesting because they essentially had a problem which Christianity had already solved. Christianity through the Trinity had this idea that like Christ is the Son of God, he's the Word of God, he's the hologos in Greek, but he also is God. Whereas the Mu'tazila and the Ashari, they had this problem of, okay, well, the Quran is the Word of God. And anything that God like spoke, that must also be eternal. So did the Quran exist before it was spoken, or was it created at this point in time? And because the Quran has some instances of what's called naskh, and naskh in Arabic means abrogation. Yeah. So it abrogates itself in some instances. So you could say, well, how could it have come before, like the creation of the universe, if it abrogates itself? And, they had all of these debates and questions. But
yeah, go ahead.
Well, the Quran itself, as well as the Hadith, speak to the punishment for irtidad or apostasy. And the punishment for irtidad is, of course, death, as you know. And that makes it very sticky. It makes it very sticky. There's a reason why even in inverted commas, secular Muslim countries like Turkey, for instance, you really don't want to go around saying to people, hey, guys, I've become a Christian. In Turkey, you can say, to a certain extent, you can say, I'm not really sure I believe in God or whatever. And people will be like, oh, akhi, bro, you have to believe. But they're not really going to hurt you. But if it comes to, okay, I've left Islam and I've become a Christian, or I've become a Jew, or I've become a Buddhist, then you're now at the point where there's a general social understanding that people have around you, which is, oh, this guy is opening himself up to extreme violence and or death. And this is one of the memes that makes Islam incredibly sticky, right? There's a reason why honor killings, and honor killings is just one type of killing. There are many other types of killing, extrajudicial killings that happen in Europe, as you're full aware, as a result of this. So yeah, I would say that Islam is very sticky. And the problem with, again, I want to not just talk about immigration for 2 hours, but the problem that we've walked into here is just assuming that what our society is, this is a norm, and when they come here, then our norms become their norms, and so on and so forth. But in reality, what's been happening in Europe is that social evolution has occurred within Islamic communities in various ways, and it's in response to environmental conditions, as it always is. So they're here, and they're like, well, okay, we don't fit in. And then you have sort of several paths you can take, let's say. And one of the paths would be, I don't know, I'm going to now become a really hardcore Muslim because, this is difficult for me to make my religion work here, so I have to go even harder. And then some people do the kind of liberal Muslim thing where, you see a lot of girls in London, where I grew up mostly, they wear hijab, they wear like the abaya or whatever, and then they have a ton of lipstick and the skin tight clothes or whatever. So there are all kinds of different responses, but those should be seen also as forms of evolution. If you want micro-social evolution even, I would go so far as to say. And it's not just like, you can't understand what's going on unless you include the evolutionary aspect. I think it was the Russian-American Orthodox Christian biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky, who said nothing in biology can be understood except in the light of evolution. I would posit that nothing in culture, actually nothing in history or society can be understood outside of the context of evolution.
Okay, so there's a lot there that we need to unpack.
Let's do it.
So let's talk about the, I want to talk about the stickiness, but I want to go back to something you said before. I want to kind of make a link to see that make sure I know that I understand this. Is culture ultimately biological?
Okay, that's a really, really tough one. Because if you are a physical determinist, right? Perfectly reasonable view, ipso facto, nothing intrinsically wrong with it. That has implications, for example, the functioning of the brain, right? Now, there are actually three interesting theories about how the mind connects to the body and the brain. One would be, in the determinist sort of logical perspective, that evolution is a physical, chemical, biological process. And you have cells, you have prokaryotes, eukaryotic organisms with mitochondria in the cells, and they develop and develop and develop, and they build these things to do things and solve problems, and then you get us. In this view, you ultimately end up with consciousness being kind of an illusion, which is very much the sort of Sam Harris perspective. And I think it's perfectly reasonable if this is your belief, if these are your axioms, if this is where you're coming from, that you could arrive to that destination. And then everything in culture then is sort of just as predetermined in the same way as, for example, the position of particles is sort of predetermined, right? But then you have this big problem, which is, quantum physics, and you have the superposition, you have the photon, which is a particle or wave, and all of this stuff, all of this kind of ambiguity. And I think that's a real challenge to the idea of physical determinism, insofar as it introduces an element of, well, we're not really sure what, but at least randomness into the social process, right? Which means that a society is not merely like the sum of like, you and I here, this could be called like a micro society, and you have these genetics and I have these genetics, and therefore consciousness is an illusion and we're just experiencing it. But then there's that randomness that you can't really get away from. And so the other view of how the mind relates to the brain and the body is emergentism, which is one that I find much more attractive and appealing. And it's like, so the mind, in this view, the mind is an emergent property of the brain. The mind is not in the brain. The mind is, okay, here's a good way to understand this. We're having a conversation right now. Where is our conversation? Where is it? Is it in you? Is it in me? No, of course not. It's between us. It's in the connections. Right now, there's a social connection that is activated whenever two individuals engage in a conversation, right? We have this social connection. So the conversation is like here. It's like bouncing back and forth between us. That's where the conversation is. So in this view, you look at the mind and you apply the same logic. You understand it the same way. The mind is, if you'd like, the conversation between the brain and also, I would say, the body as well. Because as you know, I know you're into, for example, health and gut health and stuff like this is very, very important. I am as well. And of course, you already know about how, a great deal of our body's serotonin is produced, by bacteria in our guts, and then the vagus nerve is sort of feeding this back up to the brain, everything like that. So the body itself also plays a huge role in then the mind and consciousness. No, sorry, go ahead.
Just so I'm trying to relate this back to the original question of, to what extent is culture shaped by evolution?
I think this is it, right? This is it right here. Culture cannot be seen as just, in the same way you can't see the mind as just a purely physical thing, I think. Emergentism is much more attractive. Then culture becomes sort of this emergent property. Culture is like a conversation between all these individuals who share this common destiny, common historical descent, right? That's kind of what culture is. And because the environment changes over time, the people change over time, just like the ship of Theseus, right? Yeah. Then that's culture evolving. So culture does evolve, but it's not a strict analog.
Yeah, what do you mean by evolve in that sense?
Okay, so evolution is just really, it's the change of a system. Remember, you and I are systems, right? We're biological systems. We're individuals, but we are a system. It's whether you look at, I prefer to look at it through like the trinity of mind, body, and brain, right? That's attractive to me intrinsically as a metaphor. But society is also a system. I take a lot here from Donella Meadows, she was one of the first female researchers at MIT. She taught at Dartmouth College for some 20-something years from 1972. She wrote a book, it was actually published posthumously, called Thinking in Systems, a Primer. It was published, I believe, around 2008, although I didn't read it till much later. And in that book, she basically breaks down for me, what it was for me was, I used to think that evolution was something that was only kind of biological. You have these biological systems and whatever. And she's like, no. The same principles, the same rules, the same logics exactly apply to social systems, technological systems, even microcultures, like a company, for example, will evolve.
Like a universal Darwinism.
Yeah, pretty much. But the problem then with saying universal Darwinism is you risk confusing people a little bit, because they're going to say, oh, well, you're saying that it's some kind of social Darwinism, right?
So what's the adaptive mechanism there in social and cultural evolution?
I would say that the best example of that is probably by looking at just capitalism, right? Because capitalism is I would say it's more of a process than a system itself. Although, at a certain point, words kind of lose all meaning if you dig too far deep into them. So it's just sticking fairly vague here. But capitalism as a process, what does it do? It allows societies economically and also, socially and culturally as well to adapt to problems. So you have a problem. Oh, shit, we need to solve that problem. Someone has to solve that problem. So then this incentivizes people who have the requisite skills and knowledge and interest, whether they work in teams or they work individually, to propose a solution to that problem, right? However, when you do that, as I sort of mentioned at the outset of this discussion, you're also changing the operating environment itself. So, for example, the example I like to use is with koalas, right, from Australia. And koalas are, again, some of the dumbest, smallest, and smoothest brained animals in the mammalian kingdom. They're functionally retarded. I remember when I was in Australia one time, and there was a guy who was showing off this koala, and it was hugging him very nicely. And then the moment he put the koala down, it just started to scream and cry like the most. I love children, I really do, but like the most pathetic baby that you've ever seen, and full-grown animal. Well, why are they like that? Well, that's a consequence of evolution, actually. It's a consequence of adaptation, because koalas, they on the ground, they're not able to survive so well, so effectively. I believe one of the reasons was actually the Tasmanian tiger, which hunted them voraciously. And so they go up into the trees, and now they're in the trees, but here we have a problem, because the only thing you can eat in the eucalyptus trees is the leaves, which don't provide much nutrition. So they evolved to say, okay, we're now in this ecology, we're going to evolve these kind of smaller brains, right? Because that's going to work for us. And then we're just going to scream and yell and grunt and reproduce and not think about very much at all. So capitalism, I would say, can also do that. It can actually decrease function. So let me give you an instance of this, right, in practice. Books were for a long time the medium of acquiring information. You wanted to know something, you had to sort of go to a library, you had to get the book, or you go to a bookstore, you buy it. And it's a hard task, right, to obtain information. It's difficult, it's challenging. And now, of course, we have ebooks. And there are all of these websites, I won't name them, where you can illegally download like millions and millions of ebooks, whatever you want. And I've observed, I first noticed this when I was at Cambridge among my colleagues, that just having ebooks doesn't mean that you'll read them. There's this sort of weird false security it provides, right? It's like, okay, I have this book. And then like I look at my friend's phone, he's like got 200 books. It's like all of them are sitting on 0%, you know what I mean? And so in essence, any sort of evolutionary process by solving problems can either increase functionality in a sense or decrease. I think with the instance of ebooks, we solve the problem of, okay, you have to go to the library, you have to acquire the book. But also inherently, it seems to reduce the human incentive to actually engage with the product of what you've purchased, right?
I'm thinking TikTok, like TikTok brain.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So another one, not TikTok, but Tinder. Right, one that was the first big one, but it's only one of many applications that has now completely transformed our society's view of dating, commitment, monogamy, stuff like this. Right, Tinder was created via the process of capitalism to solve a problem. Right, you have a problem in biological evolution, you can
think
solve.
of a funny way to frame what that problem is. But yeah, please go.
Well, there are many funny ways, but so thus far, if you're sticking with me, it's sort of the same thing with biological or social. It's like we have a problem, we solve it. Now we're in a new environment, we have new problems. So in the context of Tinder, what did it do? It solved the problem of distance, right? Because it's hard to meet people. It's hard to find people. It actually is. Even paradoxically, right? We're in Budapest right now. It's a city of somewhere between 1.52 million people. It depends on, the illegal immigrants who unfortunately are in here in some small number. And also, suburbs, how far out you count. But that's a lot of people. And yet paradoxically, in cities like this, which is the biggest city in Hungary, obviously the smaller cities in the US are much bigger, it's really hard to meet people. All of my colleagues are telling me, oh yeah, I want to date, but it's really hard to meet people. And so, Tinder comes in. Great, now we have this solution. But having this solution itself, it brings changes to the operating environment such that the human interactional experience becomes devalued in some way, actually much like with the ebook thing. And you see this especially...
What do you mean by it? What do you mean devalued?
Well, I'll explain. Like, you see this especially with female users of Tinder, where they'll rack up because you can just swipe right and you're guaranteed it's going to be a match. And so they rack up these 200 matches, 300 matches, and they haven't messaged any of them. They haven't messaged a single one. And the guys have just sent the messages like, hey, you out, you up, what's up, or whatever. But the reality is if that same girl were to, for example, go to a bar in a nice environment, right? In an environment that's actually fitting for her organismically and also, her mentality and her culture. Let's say it's a bookstore bar and she's a university student. I know a fantastic bookstore bar, which is for sort of Hungarian traditionalist philosophy that I used to go to quite a lot. It's a nice wine bar. And there, it's pretty much guaranteed that, if you're a girl and you go there, you would have a much better experience simply talking to practically any guy of your age bracket there. So in that sense, this is like Tinder itself, it's a technological perturbation, or it's a change in the environment, and then it further changes us. So this actually...
It's covariant.
Yes. And this is really what I study as a scientist. I'm interested in this tripartite or triune relationship between, technology, individual psychology and behavior, rationalization, and then culture or society. So
a couple of things have been running through my mind in this conversation. One of them is the idea of a telos built into culture as a consequence of evolution. The other one is simply a macro level example, perhaps more pedestrian, of North Korea and South Korea. Their ancestors were subject to the same evolutionary conditions, food, temperature, etc. They have radically different societies, so that would kind of take off any kind of determinism off of the table. Yeah, go ahead, you're nodding, go ahead.
No, I'm simply agreeing with you. Please go on. Yeah.
So if these are adaptive, if culture can be looked at, and tell me if you think there's a problem in my thinking, as an adaptive mechanism for a specific problem to be solved or what have you, that has no necessary endpoint. What better explains the wealth of nations? Genes or memes?
Ooh, let me get into that second. I'll go in order.
Sure. So we'll I gave you Korea. Both of those. They're somewhat disconnected, but they
they definitely
together
match. They definitely fit onto each other. So first of all, let's talk about Korea. The Koreas.
Please.
I'm a big lover of the Koreas historically and culturally. I've been there only obviously to the south for a summer school program. What I would say is that if you look in North Korea, what do you notice? Right? What do you notice? Well, one of the things that you might notice, I don't know, having not been there, but
when you can see,
what literally you can see is, let's talk about the DMZ, for instance. This is a place you can see. You look at the average height.
I meant that was a joke about like when you can see because they don't have electricity.
No, exactly right. If you look at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, which separates North Korea from its southern counterpart, you will observe that the guards there are basically selected, right? There's a different type of selection mechanism to be the biggest, the most fearsome, the most intimidating, and beefy, buff guys that you can possibly conjure up. And you see that on the North Korean side, they're standing like, I don't know, 5'5", pretty small. And on the South Korean side, you have these hulking, beastly guys who I don't know what they're taking. But the point there would be that even in this context, even in such a short period of time, you see, and this is not really biological evolution maybe, but it's more social.
Yeah.
And you see that due to the lack of food resources, right? And this is maybe something that sort of connects to the koalas, but I want to be very clear, I'm not making any sort of racial statement about North Koreans. I am saying that due to malnutrition and general lack of food, the height has sort of changed. So that would be an instance. That's an environmental change. South Korea, though, has the lowest birth rate in the entire world. I don't recall exactly what it is. Maybe you do like 0.61, something like this. I don't know. But you know what's really interesting about that is South Korea actually banned pornography. Right? South Korea banned a long time ago. Pornography is completely illegal in South Korea. And in the West, in the United States right now, for example, you have a number of states which have sort of required age verification for use of pornography, which I personally support, both as a Christian and as a scientist, for a number of reasons. But it shows you how the expected outcome of a policy isn't necessarily what you're going to get. Like
you're saying that's causal?
No. I wouldn't say it's causal, right? I wouldn't say that if you legalize porn, then of course birth rates are going to go up. That seems ridiculous to me. On the other hand, I would say that I'm going back to Donella Meadows here. These are complex dynamic systems, right? Cultures, societies, just like species are in the biological context, they're complex dynamic systems and they exist within systems, they're nested. And so you can't just like sort of make one intervention and expect the whole system-wide thing to be changed.
Sure.
But now I want to go to your second question about, is it genes or is it culture? Because this is the real hot pocket.
Genes or memes, yeah.
Genes or memes, I'm sorry. So I believe, and you knew I was going to say this, but I believe that it has to be both. However, I want to be more clear about what I mean by that.
I did know you were going to say that.
Yeah, of course you did. Joe Henrich, again, to go back to him at Harvard, is one of the proponents of what he calls gene culture coevolution.
Yeah, he was on the show.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's a great guy. He has been actually very vociferous in his advocacy for gene culture coevolution as a principle. And so the idea is, to use my sort of hands here, it's not like genes and culture or genes and memes. It's like this kind of interplay where they're going back and forward in this continuous dance, very much resembling, if you look at it on a 2D plane, the double helix, right? Which is kind of fun. The double helix structure of DNA. So I would say that it is both. It has to be both. And, cultural...
So you're not buying the guns, germs, and steel, Jared Diamond?
Oh, no, absolutely not. No, Jared Diamond didn't know what he was talking about. I've read that book multiple times, and each time I read it, I get progressively disappointed. Like my disappointment levels, I thought could not increase, but actually did. Let's give some ancestral historic examples of gene culture coevolution, right? Just for the sake of the audience. Yeah. We have, for instance, the whole the cultural changes that were associated by the movements of humans and Neanderthals and other hominid species out of Africa, right? However long ago that occurred, there's a lot of, that's becoming a really hot issue again for the first time, really since the 1970s. So I don't want to go too much into details or give any year dates or numbers. But what I will say is that it's clear that as you go more north, it gets colder, especially when you go back to stuff like, the Ice Age and, even 6,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, still this was a factor. So when it gets colder, what happens? You have to wear clothes. You have to wear lots of clothes, actually.
I thought you were going to go someplace else with that. Okay.
No, but you have to have intricate forms of clothing and protection. And you also have to build shelters. You have to build increasingly intricate forms of shelter. So what does this do? And this is the fun part that I love. What this does is it's a cultural change, which then, as we've been talking about throughout this conversation, constitutes a sort of change to the overall operating environment. Because now, what happens to the people who can't, create or craft or maintain clothing? What happens to the people who can't create or craft or maintain shelter? What happens to the people who can't, be diligent enough to sort of save their agricultural harvest when we get into agriculture, which is obviously a much later development, throughout the winter? Well, they die. And so that itself is a sort of selection mechanism that acts upon genes. And then, it becomes further elaborated from there. And we get this sort of delicate dance between genes and culture, which is obviously still going on today.
Is being able to drink milk in adulthood another example of a catalyst?
A catalyst for, Yeah, I would say absolutely yes. So for instance, I can't remember the specific gene variant. It's that encodes for that enzyme which allows you to break down lactose and other milk products. But certainly, because now you have an additional source of calories, right, that you didn't have before. And it's not just calories, it's really good calories. It's like milk has, and I love full fat milk. I will advocate to all of your listeners that full fat is the way to go. But if you're drinking milk, then you have this great source of actually animal proteins and fats and also sugars as well, which readily bioavailable, very easy to drink, instant energy. And you look at countries where those genes that allow you to break down milk and the associated enzymes are most common. Countries like the Netherlands, for instance, right, or countries like Serbia.
Yeah,
those are some big boys.
Yeah, I was thinking of countries in which regions of the world in which there large numbers of people as a percentage of the population are lactose intolerant.
Yeah, and there you sort of often see the opposite trend. However, it's not necessarily so simple. So East Africa, I think a lot of East Africans are historically cattle herders, especially around, for example, Ethiopia. And if you go a little lower into kind of Kenya, I'm not sure if that's why precisely, but they're obviously very tall, as I'm sure you're aware. But yeah, it's an example of an adaptation that then selects for genes and results in this beautiful process that we call cultural evolution and gene culture coalition.
Yeah. Okay. So in that process, for example, has it been enough time for the printing press to change our genes?
Ooh, well, there are some researchers. I'm not terribly familiar with this literature, but I have read some of the associated papers, I can't recall the names, who argue that essentially there was a very intense gene culture coevolution mechanism that has been documented and studied in England specifically, over the last, I think, between maybe 1300 and 1800, something like that, where basically if you were a murderer or if you were a rapist, you're killed. Right? And we know that, psychopathy, for instance, which is something that would make it more intrinsically likely for you to commit an act such as murder or rape. Psychopathy is in large part genetic. I don't know the exact correlation coefficient, but I know in general that for height, it's roughly the same as it is for I think personality is a little bit lower, maybe 0.5, 0.6, but height is 0.8. So we know that if you kill or lock up all the murderers, then over time, yeah, of course, there's going to be change, which there's going to be evolution, which in that case, I would call that progress, right? And this is where we get to the tricky thing. When is evolution progress and when is it regress?
Yeah, I was going to say, okay, so if it's okay with you, I'd like to bracket that and not bring the concept of progress in now, because that's a whole, because then we need to make evaluative judgments as opposed to being descriptive, but I'm more than happy to do that.
I'm not sure we do, but we can get into that later.
Okay, well, all right, then we'll get into it now. But before I do that, I just want to ask you a question. So does what you just said, does it explain why a certain population is disproportionately awarded Nobel Prizes?
I would say yes.
How so?
If you are an individual within a culture that occupies a certain niche, I remember what I said earlier about humans being masterful social niche constructors, right? So you have this sort of sociocultural niche. What are the mechanisms that are associated with higher fitness, right? Higher biological fitness, reproductive fitness in that niche? Well, book reading, memorization abilities, obviously general literacy and writing skills. What if that population, this hypothetical population, which could be any population in the world, we're not going to even name them, what if this population also, as a result of certain types of oppression or legalistic discrimination, is not allowed to take certain occupations except those which are really dependent upon those abilities, those faculties, such as, for example, bookkeeping or making loans and stuff like this. And you think
over time that plays out genetically in terms of fitness?
What happens
if you're from mechanism?
What happens if you're from that population and you can't do any of those things? There's not really a place for you, is there? So you can either sort of leave that society, and this actually happened quite a lot historically. Yeah. You did have people who were from a specific sort of small culture or cultural clade within a larger group, and they weren't able to fit into the norms. They couldn't keep up. They do whatever. Right? If your average IQ is 100, then half of or if the modal IQ is 100, then half of people are going to be below that, right? So what happens to those people? Well, they often exited. Actually, it's always been a thing. You see this. in any number of cultures throughout the world, people leave if they're not able to keep up with the requirements and the demand. So that also, is a further push on selection. And I would say that what we're discussing, this specific case study, is relatively uncontested, except for some people on the very far right and some people on the sort of left or far left.
You realize that the inference that people will draw for that, and the reason that you just said something that cannot be spoken, is because the instant you admit that there are a certain number of people above a threshold, that must mean by definition there are people below it.
Yes, clearly.
But you can't, in the United States, like you can't even, that's the thing that cannot be spoken.
Yeah, and we don't have to speak it here, but what I would say is that, first of all, we're not in the United States, so welcome.
Right.
And secondly, I would also say that let me take this to a religious mode for a second. Like I am a Christian. I'm a Coptic Orthodox Christian. I truly do believe that the spark of divinity exists in every single human being, that we are ensouled. And I would say that when you look at some things like, for example, Chomsky's universal grammar, right? To me, the fact that Coco the gorilla, sorry to some of the listeners who may believe otherwise, but Coco the gorilla could not, in fact, speak. That's now been conclusively debunked. The evidence on that is completely minimal. Nim Chimpsky, the other primate that they tried to get to speak, his longest number of signs, I think it was like 21 or 28 consecutive signs, was something that amounted to give me orange, you give me orange, eat orange, give me orange, you. Something like that, right? And he's just, it's just...
and never a question.
Never a question. It's
except that parrot asked that question, am I great? But keep going.
I haven't heard of that parrot, but that's definitely something that we should talk about after the podcast, because I love parrots and I'd love to hear more about that. But my point would be, I would say, and Peter, son of Paul, I'm not going to, we don't have to get into the theological debate, but I would say that if you are someone who, as I am, believes in the human soul and everything like this, and with all of the baggage, for good or bad, that entails, the bad would be stuff like your original sin, stuff like this, then it is incumbent upon you as a thinking Christian to acknowledge that just because somebody maybe doesn't fit in a certain niche, that doesn't mean they're not entitled a niche, right? Every human being is entitled their own niche, and the UN Declaration of some UN
universal rights,
maybe, or on indigenous peoples. It specifically points out that cultures have a right to sort of develop, and I think develop autonomously.
Is that your sovereignty? Does that relate back to your sovereignty idea?
Sorry, say again, please.
Does that relate back to the sovereignty idea?
Yes, it absolutely does. And thank you for picking up on that. Yes. And so I would say that, like, okay, the problem really, and it's more of an American problem, is we want to make everyone listen to our pop music and wear our blue jeans. But some people maybe, forgive the crudeness of this, some people don't like pop music. Or maybe pop music is intrinsically unappealing for like whatever reason to some proportion of people. Or maybe some people can't fit into blue jeans, just hypothetically, right? You understand that I'm using these as metaphors. So
I do.
So in that context, let's say you have a small percentage of your population, like 13% or whatever it might be, who just like don't like wearing blue jeans or don't like pop music, right? That's not to say that they aren't entitled a culture that develops autonomously, that is like owned by them and that they participate in, and et cetera, et cetera. That's the solution. So the solution is not necessarily like, okay, well, we have these... I'm sorry to interrupt you. The solution to what problem? The solution to the problem of individuals not fitting in to a larger social framework or a set of rules or a game. I'm an evolutionary game theorist. I really like to look at these things as, the meta game, right? Culture is a kind of meta game in response to the environmental problems and the psychology of the individuals who populate it. So if you take that, then you say, okay, he doesn't fit into my culture. Does that mean that he's not entitled to his own culture? Absolutely not. Like, it's just the problem is the attempt to push together things that maybe don't fit in too well on the macro level. And this, I really have to be clear about this because, on the micro level, you have a lot more permeability. I already talked about people leaving certain cultures if they didn't fit in. You also have people joining certain cultures if they do fit in, right? Yeah. And like, I've come here to Hungary, for example. I've lived in Hungary for 3 years. I am not Hungarian. I'm not Hungarian. My children will be. But I can like fit in slowly into this culture by like picking up aspects, learning the language, assimilating, becoming a part of the society. I'll have Hungarian parents-in-law, stuff like this. Like that's possible for individuals. But on the group level, does that mean that, for example, my culture, which is just, let's say, British culture or American culture, Anglo-American culture, is that the same as or compatible with Hungarian culture? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Like they're different cultures. There's different norms and values around like acceptable behavior, ways of doing things, problem solving, everything, right? And you could, this little analogy that I've just constructed, you could take that back to what you were alluding to earlier, that which shall not be said. These are different cultures, but of course you can have the individuals crossing, from one way to another, and that's fine.
Okay, so I've been trying to keep the conversation descriptive as opposed to evaluative. You've bumped into the evaluative domain, which we should get to since it's emerged. So a couple of questions first. Can a culture objectively progress or degrade?
Okay, so I thank you for that question, because that's the real heavy lifting that I want to get into here. Now, in 1913, a Russian biologist, you'll have to forgive, I hope the listeners will forgive me here because I can't actually recall his exact last name, but it's Alexei Streletsovsky, something like this. Maybe we can put it up on the screen. But he came up with this idea of aromorphosis. Now, aromorphosis is a Greek word. It comes from aro, which means like are, which is like towards, like, and morphosis, which is the changing of forms. What does this mean? Well, aromorphosis is basically when quantitative gradual change becomes qualitative. So what does that mean? Okay, let's say you have an animal, and the animal can run around on the ground, and it can eat, and it can do whatever. Okay, so it can eat in this. It can live, breed, have fun, socialize, operate within this sort of three-dimensional plane of just like the ground. But then one day, for whatever reason, this animal, however many number of animals from this species acquire flight. They acquire the ability to fly. So they can do everything that they could do before, but they also have this whole new domain unlocked, right? So we have to step back. How did they fly? Well, first of all, they got these little pinions that maybe help them run faster. They run faster, faster, faster. That's a quantitative change. It's not qualitative. They're just running faster, right? It's still running. It's still something they could do before. And they run fast, 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 so fast. Wings get bigger. Now they can fly. That's the qualitative change. So automorphosis in biological evolution is the point in which the organism progresses quantitatively in a way that leads to a qualitative shift in its ability to access resources and perform higher functions in its environment.
So you just snuggled in a value there.
Oh, tell me.
Well, you went from the descriptive to describing it to saying that the consequence of that is better.
I would say that has to be, let me step back here. They're doing everything that they did before, but like better in a way that doesn't require value judgments. Like to be able to acquire more calories is better intrinsically for the organism, right? Is it not? I mean, unless you want to fight with me on that one.
Then you're gonna, yeah.
I don't think that, I don't see that as a value judgment. I see that as like 1 + 1 = 2 itself. It's sort of coming from that axioms of biology itself.
Because you mentioned, I'm still so many things from our conversation are lingering. You mentioned Harris before.
Yeah.
And one of the claims that he makes is that built into the very idea of being, or he doesn't say being, but of humanity is this idea of flourishing. And so those adaptive behaviors would allow one to flourish. And Christian apologists have accused him of smuggling in that value. Uh-huh. And I was curious as to how you would respond to that.
I would agree with them insofar as I don't think that flourishing is so self-evident or objective. Flourishing is...
The ability to get more calories would be an example of...
No, but I don't think that's flourishing, because already, you look at like rats, and rats exist to, procreate and acquire calories, right? So remember, the point of a system is what it does. So that's the system of rats. That's what they do.
Right.
And so a rat being able to acquire more calories is ipso facto, by definitions, of the intrinsic, self-describing form of the system, which you didn't describe it. It presented itself to you.
Right.
So you're not making any value judgments. That's what the rat exists to do. Now the rat has developed some capacity which allows it to do it better. So better is not better as in, I'm not making a deontological judgment. I'm not making a moral prescription. I'm just saying it can do something. You could replace it with efficiently. You could replace better with efficiently.
Works. If you like. Okay, so that works. So that would be a pragmatic
Yes.
a goal and not a value judgment.
Yes, and more efficiently. And so I apologize for my wording, but I really like that you're keeping me on my toes here because I appreciate it. It helps me think with more clarity. So now I've described this sort of biological automorphosis. Let's take this to society. So what would a social automorphosis look like? Right? That's
Change of forms.
Change of forms that comes from a gradual change in quantities, right? And if you think about it, this is the problem with Alexei's work and the subsequent biologists like Leonid Grinin, Peter Turchin, many of whom have borrowed from this and used the term automorphosis. The problem with it is that it doesn't really have like a negative, right? So that you have you change your form and acquire more. You do everything you already did better, but also there's this whole new domain unlocked.
Right.
Well, what about the inverse of that? Could we postulate something like that? I think we can. So let's think about, culturally or socially, cases of positive and negative automorphosis, just for the sake of argument. So I would have one for you right away.
Sure.
I would say that what we did with communications technology, like the written word, which began, as far as we know, but who really knows, back in Mesopotamia with cuneiform, right? And you have these people are keeping these records and stuff. And originally, the likelihood is that this script came out of a sort of tally keeping, like you were writing down this. I have one goat, I have two goats, I have three, and then it gets more complex, more complex, more complex. And this complexity, complexity in the script is it's slow quantitative changes. But then suddenly you get to the point where you can write entire letters, and now you can have instead of you as a king being able to rule one city, now you can rule two cities, right? Because you can send messages back and forth and they can receive these messages clear as day, and all of your edicts are now applying in two cities rather than one. That's automorphosis. It's a perfect example of a positive automorphosis. You've gone from city-state ruler to regional warlord or king or emperor.
Yeah, I'm really not laughing at you. I'm only laughing because literally this morning I talked to the Australian philosopher of science, Brett Hall, about something almost identical to that, and remarkable serendipity. Okay, so did you want to finish that, Doc? Because I have so many questions.
No, and I love the questions. This is really fun. So, but then let's think about what the negative might be. Right?
Yeah, what would the negative be?
This is really tricky. This is really tricky. So first of all, just definitions, right? A negative automorphosis would have to be, if we simply invert it, then you would have to say it's a graduated loss in something or less efficient, and then you lose something entirely. I think we have a couple of examples of that. So Aboriginal Australians, for instance, originally must have had boats. They must have had boats. Otherwise, they couldn't have got there. There's a continental shelf, the Australian continental shelf, and then Indonesia, which used to be largely above water. But there's still this gap. They couldn't have done it if they didn't have boats, right? And so they arrive in Australia, or actually I think originally it would have been something like Papua they would have arrived, and then kind of gradually gone down. And then they gradually, over time, they lose some kind of seafaring technologies. They stop fishing. They go more into the woodlands or the highlands or the deserts or whatever. And then eventually they lose the ability entirely to construct boats and go across oceans. So this would be an example. Obviously, this is really, really can be controversial.
Speculative.
Stuff. Yeah.
Well, there's an alternative explanation for that.
Please.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that we know that Aboriginals, I always find myself being very judicious with my words in these, when we talk about these kinds of things.
One must be.
Yeah, because you're talking about something that's just the third rail. You can't really talk about any of this stuff. But we know that the spatial abilities and recognition for the people of whom you've just spoken are the highest in the world, even above Ashkenazi Jews. And part of the hypothesis for that is that the smart ones came back when they went out hunting. And so those migration patterns are less a product of any technology at the time and more a product of large numbers of people roaming further and further, and then those encampments then growing holistically that way.
Yeah. I love that response. Thank you. And you see something else also in northern Siberia. So the first thing, obviously Robin Dunbar, but there's a paper by, I believe it was one of his PhD students, Pearson Dunbar 2012, something like that, which was on various longitudes and brain size and also the orbital volume. And they found that like the more north you go, the volume of the orbits increases dramatically. And the hypothesis is...
Yeah, go ahead, talk, because that, I mean, now we're going to demonetize for that comment. But go ahead.
We could potentially cut that out.
No, but go ahead.
Make a point. But the orbital volume of like the Eskimos is absolutely magnificent. They can see so well. And the hypothesis is that would be an adaptation to basically homogeneous environments. Like if you're in homogeneous environments, you need to be able to, okay, there's this type of snow and there's that type of snow. And then, by the way, that's a great example of gene culture coevolution. Because then you have, okay, the Eskimos have 29 different words for snow. Or what? That's what people say.
I thought that was a myth.
I doubt it would be. Because, I learned some Kazakh, and Kazakhs were like a pastoral nomadic society literally until the mid-1800s. And they have like so many different words for different types of horses. Like it's an old horse, it's a young horse, it's a sick horse, it's a girl horse, it's a boy horse. Like they have a billion different words for that.
That's interesting. So one of the things that's popping through my head is the Whorf hypothesis and how that relates to different adaptations that humans go through and how that affects their language and the covariant relationship between the language and the biological adaptation based upon the environment of groups of people.
Yeah, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is one of the ones that I find like, okay, forgive me, and I'm not trying to be evasive, but at the same time, it's so compelling, but also so kind of flimsy. And what I mean by that is like, of course, it must be true. Like if you have a concept that can only be expressed through like very precise language. And you see this in the history of early Christianity where, you have the Miaphysites and the Monophysites and the Diophysites and the Nestorians and the Armenian Christians and the Greek, and there's such specificity in wording and it matters so much to them, right? And you could say that, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in terms of like language shaping cognition, and it's not really just saying that because it's not unidirectional, it's kind of bidirectional as well. But, well, okay, like that looks like a case where like, yeah, it really, really matters. But now in modern times, like a lot of, how can I say this? The upper clergy and sort of hierarchy, I can't say exactly who or how high for reasons you'll understand, but from the Coptic Orthodox Church are kind of saying, actually some of these disagreements and splits that we've had, they were just lexical. They didn't really mean anything, right? So this would be a kind of refutation of the idea that, you need these hyper-specific words to express these hyper-specific concepts, and then that affects how you see the world. They're actually kind of saying, no, we shared the cognition, we just got lost on the words. So...
Okay, I didn't mean to take you down that rabbit hole. There's just so many things.
It's
like a proliferation of things to talk about. So I want to get back to a few things that you were talking about. I want to ask you a question. Could the ability to get calories more easily, do you think that could lead to obesity? Could that be an example of some of the...
of course it can lead to obesity, but like whether it does or not, like that's a whole other question, because of course, obesity is a symptom, not a disease, really. It's a symptom of severe metabolic dysfunction, right? And obesity is...
I'm not tracking you. What do you mean?
Like about obesity?
Yeah. What do you mean is a symptom?
Well, obesity is downstream of cultural behaviors and biological dysfunction. And the cultural behaviors, for example, let's say hypothetically, like overeating too much sugar, right? Cultural behavior.
Exactly what I was thinking.
Cultural behavior leads to biological dysfunction, metabolic dysregulation, leads to obesity. So obesity is really the symptom of many things that are sick. And you could say the cultural behavior is sick, and you could say that the human organism is sick, but you can't have the symptom without the cause.
Yeah.
But would you mind if I went back to the automorphosis thing for 1 second?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I would like to ask you a question here, Peter.
Ask me anything you want.
Like in the modern times, right, where I'm teaching these young students, and we're talking about this interplay, this delicate dance between technology, psychology, and culture. And I kind of get the feeling that something is being lost. And I can't really call it definitively. I can't put my finger on it and say, this is a negative automorphosis. We're losing a function. But I do think, for example, that when you look at like young people today, and there's a lot of people who are talking like young men and the crisis with young men, but it's completely both ways.
You mean the crisis of meaning?
Not just the crisis of meaning, the crisis of or maybe it is a crisis of meaning, but the crisis of relationships. Like men and women hate each other right now. Like they really do. Like you only need to go to any kind of woman's space online or any men's only space online. You'll see it like right away. And I wonder if we're sort of, I mean, if you look at divorce rates are obviously going up, marriage rates are going down. Like, are we in a kind of...
And they're going up and down in relation to classes. It's becoming an upper middle class.
So it's more stratified. But I just wonder if you think, Peter, on the collective level, we're at risk of losing a whole societal function. So to parallel that in biology, it would be like we used to be able to fly, now we can't, like the dodo. Do you think we're at risk of anything like that now? Or do you believe that all of the things that we have mastered, that we'll maintain mastery over those?
Unequivocally, categorically, and unshakably, I can tell you all of the things we have mastered, we are not capable of continuing to master. Those, I pick up on Reagan for this, was freedom is one generation away from being extinguished. And you can't assume because people knew things or figured things out or died for things and literally bled for things that the next generation will adopt those as values. Yeah. And nor are you really sure that they should. I am deeply concerned about not only the crisis of meaning, I'm deeply concerned, and I think even though our metaphysics are probably radically different from each other,
of course not,
you being a Christian and me being not, one of the things that conclusions I've come to is that how little that actually matters long term. So I'm interested in the functioning of a free society. One of the things that you talked about in the beginning is you didn't use this phrase, but cognitive liberty. People need the ability to make their own decisions, and the Enlightenment values live by their own lights, et cetera. I'm deeply concerned that we're losing that. I agree that, and then I'm gonna kind of argue against my own point, if I may. I'm concerned about the divisions between men and women. I'm concerned about the lack of having an honest conversation with people with whom you have a substantive disagreement. And even there's a kind of contamination among people. I think we have to start talking to each other again. Like that would be one of the main thrusts of my work. My son said something interesting to me that I've been thinking about, and I'll just throw this out to you. It may seem far afield, but I don't think it is. I think that there are general guidelines for how to live a good life and how to construct a good society. But I had a conversation with my son, and he was telling me that, a lot of the research on happiness is done with neurotypical people. So a lot of the research on happiness isn't done with, for example, people who suffer from autism, or you don't even have to say suffer. You can say people who have autism. So maybe for those people, the instant you wake up, plugging into a device and being on a device the entire day is a good life and is a happy life.
Happy, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's a kind of normative colonialism, if you will.
Oh, I love that expression. Yeah.
Yeah, I just made that up right now.
Oh, keep it. It's yours.
I'll take it. What is that little symbol? A trademark TM. But I do think that all of these things, to borrow a word that you used in the interview, they're nested. They're nested within and they're embedded within larger dynamics of a society for healthy functioning. And it is so obvious to me that we do not have that in the United States. It is so conspicuous and grotesque. And I was reading, as one should never do, I was on X, Twitter, the other night, and I was reading through this, and I was reading through some tweets, and it's so interesting to me, so many people try to balance criticisms of Harris with criticisms of Trump. And so I've criticized, Harris recently and stochastic terrorism and claims, and then people put you in another camp for that. But I'm going somewhere with this. And so the answer is yes, I think we've lost something. I think we're in danger of losing something fundamental. And I'm not just talking about the Republic or the Empire. I think we're in danger of losing what Reed had on his bio, which was do not block the road of inquiry.
Yeah.
I think we're in danger of losing methods of falsification.
Yeah.
Do not destroy the means of error correction. Yeah. That would be it. I think if we lose that, it's over. It's over for everybody.
Yeah.
And I think that this idea, like we're talking to each other, I don't know if you're going to get shit for this or not. I have no idea.
Probably will.
Yeah. So, because, Boghossian, he's an atheist or whatever. Yeah. But that attitude is part of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that answer your question, everything I just said?
Perfectly.
Okay.
Perfectly. But there's a lot of threads.
Please.
In that
push back on anything you want.
No. It's not pushing back. It's more, see, let me get real normative and let me get real just,
Please.
What am I concerned about? Okay. Well, you have people like Peter Turchin, for example, who's a colleague of mine, fantastic work. Really, he was the bedrock of my master's thesis. And Sergei Nefedov and Grinin, all the other great Russian scholars in this from Moscow State University, who I mentioned. And they are concerned with, like, how do civilizations kind of die? Like, what's the life cycle of a civilization, everything like this. Going back to like Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century Arab sociologist. And that's all great. And I love that. And, the modeling elite overproduction, political stability and instability, all of these other things. What I'm concerned about is culture. What I'm concerned about is society. What I'm concerned about is, for example, if we lose the ability to speak to people we disagree with, right? Then that has to be a negative automorphosis.
We've almost lost it already.
Precisely. And so let's trace that back for a second. I think all of this comes down to the hubris and narcissism of people like, and maybe I'll get in trouble with Facebook now, but I'm not that important, thankfully. People like Mark Zuckerberg, who, as you know, and I'm sure you will have seen it, if you've seen the Facebook origin film, the villain story, it was a bold and noble ambition. I want to connect the world, right? Here's the problem, okay? Not all people want to be connected, right? You don't invite that asshole from work over to your, Thanksgiving party. You might invite him to church as a sort of gesture or whatever, but you don't want to be in close proximity to people that you actively dislike based on this like very, very radical separation of normative assumptions about the world.
Yeah.
So building on that, I would say that as soon as we had, the mass internet and social media, it was inevitable in that process that people would be exposed to people that they really didn't like and wouldn't want to be connected with. And over time, like, what do you do if you're in that situation? If there's some guy at a bar, right, and he's like being loud and obnoxious and rude and annoying, you really don't like this guy. He's a real asshole. What are you going to do? You're going to continue sitting right next to him at the bar? No, you're going to leave. You're going to move, or you're going to fight him maybe, which I don't want to get into that because, that's a whole nother thing. But you're going to leave, right? It's separation. You have people right now in the US who have taken that to the level of the logical conclusion, which is, okay, then we have a national divorce, right?
Right. I was just thinking that.
The national divorce. And this is, to me, this is an evolutionary process. This is social evolution, because you start out with a problem. We need to connect people. You then connect people. Now you have another problem. I'm connected with people I really don't like. I don't want to be connected to them. Then you have the next step, which is the solution, which is, okay, I'm going to block this guy, I'm going to ban this guy. The problem persists. And then you have to escalate again. And you say, okay, well, now we're going to have a national divorce, or we're going to have a civil war, or whatever it is. And this is precisely why understanding like societies through, it's not even necessarily gene culture coevolution. It's this delicate interplay of technology as this sort of problem-solving thing, which creates more problems.
Right.
How these problems affect us psychologically and how that feeds up to society. Like, this is what we have to understand if we want to figure out the 21st century. Okay. Because you mentioned AI. This is only going to get more extreme. AI is solving so many problems. How many new problems is it creating? Do we even know? Of course we don't.
Okay, so I have a question for you.
Please.
I want to ask you a question. What is your opinion of this hypothesis for how societies die? It relates to our previous part of the conversation. Societies die because their anti-rational memes keep them from solving problems in enough time before they're destroyed. That's David Deutsch's idea.
I want to push back.
Please.
It's the word rational, right? Now, I very much follow the behavioral economics school on this of sort of motivated or bound rationality. I'm sorry, Kahneman, Tversky, 83, all that stuff. Yeah. I think that, let's go back to Islam for a second, if you don't mind, but this is really going to connect to what you're saying. So in the Islamic system, okay, let's take that as a whole system, right? What is rational? Well, it is rational within that system if those axioms form your cognitive framework for operating in the world as an actor. You as a rational actor are incentivized and motivated to do things. You should do certain things in order to survive and reproduce. Whatever.
I was just going to say,
you should
survive.
In that context, you should do things that I would consider to be completely abhorrent. Let me give you an example on the collective level.
Okay.
So in the Islamic system, okay, you have polygyny, which means you have 4 women per man. Polygyny, so polygyne from many women, Greek. And under this system, you inevitably run into a big problem, which is your operational sex ratio, the OSR, gets really screwed up. How do you solve that problem? Well, in the Islamic system, there's an inbuilt solution. The solution is raids. So the Arabic word for raid is ghazwa, and ghazi means like raider. It also means hero. Funny how those 2 words connect in their morality, right? And so every year, for example, the Khilafah from the Abbasid caliphs would go on these ritual raids into the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Armenian highlands, all that area, tragically. And they would, kill the men. They would take women as wives and sex slaves, and they would inevitably lose some men in the process. Some of their men would die in the process. So this was like a safety valve for that civilization, right? Because they had a problem that their system created. We have the system of polygyny. Polygyny creates this problem of the bad OSR. But you have a solution. Your solution is you go on ghazwa every single year. You lose some men, you gain some women. It all balances out, right? So what happened there? Why did Western civilization win in the sense of getting to the Industrial Revolution first and conquering the known world? Well, I would say it won because the Islamic safety valve kind of stopped working. They got to a point where with our technological progress, militarily, they weren't able to do this anymore. They couldn't do these slaving raids and fix this problem. And so then the internal contradictions of the system began to break apart. It used to be rational, and this is where I'm connecting to your point on rationality. It used to be rational to go do these slaving raids because that would solve your problem. But now it doesn't solve your problem anymore. So I would say the system doesn't die when the rational memes are outnumbered by the irrational memes. It dies when the rational memes stop making sense and they're sticky. That's when a system dies.
So 2 things came to my mind. One is that anti-rational memes destroy the means of error correction.
Well,
and rational memes facilitate it.
Well, that's a kind of definition. This is an operational definition, which I can work with.
Right. And I was going to superimpose the whole idea of blasphemy on top of the whole thing.
Sure. Of course.
Yeah.
But again, if you understand rationality as being bound to the operating environment, like it's rational in Africa, in the Congo, like not to wear that many clothes. You don't really need it because you're just going to sweat through them and then whatever. It is irrational in Sweden to not wear that many clothes because you're going to freeze to death, right? So rationality is contingent upon what your environment looks like, and whether that's a social environment, the political environment, any kind of environment. That's what influences rationality, I would say. So I believe that rationality, and you might say, oh, well, Wael, Antonius, like you're a Christian, you should believe in like the supreme objective rationality. That's a different thing. I don't even know if we'll have time for that. But I think that when we talk about it in an evolutionary context, it is bound. And so I would say the civilization dies when, for example, if you look at, who can we think of? If you take the Hittites, who were one of the great civilizations, the Indo-European civilizations that were completely annihilated during the Bronze Age collapse, wiped out off the face of the earth by the invasions of the sea peoples and whatever. They had this system of kingship and had these walled cities and they had the cows and stuff outside. And then it got like too dangerous to have your cows outside because they're going to get stolen and the fields are going to get burnt. And they couldn't solve that problem. They couldn't like move. They were like, but this is rational. We need to keep living in this way. And then the same thing kept happening and they spiraled into death. So I think that maybe the death of civilizations, so the death of cultures happened when you're rational, like what's rational to you has now been flipped upside down and you can't adapt.
So for you then, rationality is this idea embedded in that it enables individual organisms and the society itself to survive. So then dogmatism and relativism would be rational.
But aren't they?
When I'm asking.
But I'm asking you in turn. I mean,
no.
So you would not say that it's rational for a young boy who is 12 years old and has been sent to, let's talk about Canada for a second. A young 12-year-old boy, or if you don't like the age, he's 16, he's sent to a residential school, right? Where he's like maybe beaten and whipped or whatever. I don't know how bad it really was. I don't think anyone knows. But he was being like beaten or whatever if he didn't speak English instead of like Cree or Ojibwe or whatever. And, if he didn't do the prayers. And so it's rational, it's hyper rational in that context for him to be dogmatic as hell and to sort of aggressively display this to the other students and to the nuns and everything, like, look at me, I'm fitting it. Signaling, right?
Perfect, yeah.
So that's rational.
So I think in that sense, we need to further disambiguate rational. I think there's a kind of localized rationality and a more epistemically objective rationality, like an objective turn to rationality. You're laughing. You're smiling.
I'm not laughing. I'm just smiling.
No, why are you smiling? What was it about? Do you disagree?
No, because this is where you're going to make me go full blown theologian.
Go ahead, go full blown theologian, man. You go do your thing.
Look, the term localized. Okay, so you could say that bounded rationality and localized rationality are the same thing. But let me ask you, where does the sort of objective rationality that's superimposed on top of that, where does that come from?
Where does it come from? Yeah. Well, you can derive it through reason. You can figure it out.
Isn't that circular, like reason, rational?
You can figure it out. The other way you can think about it is it solves problems. It's an explanatory. And for that, we can use the work of David Deutsch and others from there. It solves problems and it explains more than the alternatives.
Well, now you're sounding very much like me kind of earlier, and the evolutionary thing of like these progressive quantitative changes, like solving more problems. But we already clarified that some problems you actually maybe don't want to solve. I think we clarified that.
Oh yeah, earlier. Like how do you kill the most people on the planet? How do you torture them the best? Yeah,
that's a great example. Like the nuclear bomb. Let's talk about that for a second. Like the nuclear bomb solved problems for America in the war. Let's be real.
No, it did.
I've lived in Japan.
Nagasaki, Hiroshima solved problems.
I lived in Japan. I visited Hiroshima. I did Japanese and cultural psychology at Cambridge. Actually, it was my thing when I started out going in this direction. And I mean, I can tell you that, from the American perspective, turning 300,000 people to water, to shadows on the ground. Oh, yeah, sure, that solves your problems. You don't have to do a ground invasion now. Everything's nice and easy. But of course, it changes the operating environment. It creates new problems. Now we're at risk of global nuclear holocaust. Right now, the game theoretic optimum for the whole world is completely shifted.
Yeah, but even that presupposes in the game theoretic that there are tools of reason and rationality that you can implement and look at that system, right? So you're looking at you created a problem, you looked at another problem, and the evaluative mechanism that you would use are reason and rationality for those.
So I would say that if reason and rationality, your objective reason and rationality, right? Let's be clear on what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the atheistic, I would say somewhat materialist.
There is no like atheistic anything. There's no atheistic metaphysics. There's no atheistic anything.
I think to not be, in a sense, is also to be not that. It's like the opposite side.
Well, instead of atheistic, how about naturalistic?
Well, I don't believe it's naturalistic though. I believe that my rationality is much more like naturalistic in the sense.
Oh, you're saying my rationality isn't naturalistic?
No, I'm saying your concept of this like superordinate rationality that is basically like. What you're describing is you have like any number of local rationalities, right? But then above those is this like higher order, meta, objective rationality, which is always right because it solves problems.
Well, you could think of it as an evolutionary epistemology, or you could think of it as truth with a capital T. There are many ways to conceptualize or frame that.
I think that there is a mechanism. The way I would describe what you're talking about, I hope I don't offend you here with my sort of somewhat argumentative
stance. It is literally impossible for you to offend me. There's literally nothing that you could say.
I'm very, very, very happy to hear that. I'm safe for now. But I would say that the way that I would see what you're talking about, right, is as more of a mechanism, okay? And let me explain what I mean by this. So there are problems. We kind of gradually through, evolutionary processes sort of become more adapted to solving those problems better, changes the environment, new problems, whatever. That mechanism, I see that as essentially the precursor to the localized rationalities in a sense. Because if you're not, if you're not adapting,
let's accept that by fiat. Let's go with it.
We can, because I would justify it, because if you are engaged in the process of, for example, trying to be more boundedly, forgive the silly English, but boundedly rational within, let's say, the Islamic system, the school I mentioned.
You can situate those localized rationalities in the larger context. It has to come from somewhere. Sure.
It has to come. If you had no meta rationality of adaptation, then you wouldn't, why would you adapt? There wouldn't be any possibility of these localized bounded rationalities, right? So I think that in that sense, we're maybe talking about the same thing, but we're looking at it from completely different perspectives. And if I could just linger 1 second on this.
Sure.
I think that that's when you found something true, right? Like I was...
what do you mean by that?
I was at a museum with here in the Budapest Fine Arts Museum. They have this incredible exhibition right now. It's called Kingdom of Mesopotamia, Kingdom of Gods and Demons. It's amazing. You really should go. I was there with my fiance, and we're kind of looking at this work of art, this incredible work of art. And we're standing next to each other. I'm like, wow, that's so incredible. She's like, yeah, that's so incredible. And we're staring, and then we go away and we talk about what we saw. And then we realize that we were looking at completely different parts of the artwork. We weren't looking at the same thing at all.
Yeah.
There was a thing there that existed objectively, and we both were looking at it from different perspectives, but for both of us, it was beautiful, it was real, it was true.
That's Gadamer's hermeneutics.
Yeah.
Right? And so do you buy into the notion of consilience, that all truth reconciles?
I think that this is really fun now. I think I can agree with you more. Than before. I think I can, because now that we've sort of shifted, or I've adapted your terms to fit my mind, which is obviously not the same mind. Now I can sort of see that, yes, the higher order stuff does have to be conciliant. But of course, the bounded rationalities of a given civilization, society, or even gender, right? What's rational for a woman to do in a date versus a man is different. Those rationalities are obviously not necessarily going to be conciliant.
Okay, so now I think we're on the same page.
Yeah.
So now I want to go back to what you said about the art museum, and I haven't seen it. So
you got to go now.
Yeah. So Reed and I will head out there. But I want to talk about that. I want to shift it to a second. Tell you that one thing that's been extremely useful in my thinking, that's helped me just tremendously, and it's this Popperian notion of having a corrective mechanism within something. And so when you look at a piece of art, and I've been accused of scientism, right? This idea that's all truth has to be known through science and something can't be. So once I've started thinking about this idea that there's a corrective mechanism in things, and when you latch onto a corrective mechanism, that's a prophylactic against delusion. I think that idea of a corrective mechanism is really helpful.
Yeah.
In the way that we think about problems and solving problems, and what that is in relation to truth. Because I find that to be just absolutely fascinating and absent in almost the whole educational process.
Yeah. So I'm really glad that we got here, and I think that we definitely need to talk about this. So one of the things that concerns, I do believe, right, that whether you are a evolutionists looking at this, whether you're a Christian looking at this, whether you're even a physical determinist, whatever, the error correcting mechanism is inherently there. It's built into the systems in some sense, whether by natural selection or whatever. But, and we have a big but.
Yeah.
I am very concerned right now about obviously technologies that I've sort of mentioned that disrupt various processes or change them for better or worse. One of those technologies that I'd like to talk about, Peter, with you for a while, if you don't mind, is drugs, and specifically psychoactive drugs of various kinds. Whether we're talking about giving children Adderall or stuff like this, or whether we're talking about LSD, and right now MDMA and DMT are surging in popularity, in particular because of the work of certain podcast hosts, I would say. So in the United States, in the 1960s, something happened which I would say disrupted both socially and individually, but I'm interested in both, and we can talk about both cases.
Yeah.
The error correcting mechanism. Okay. So again, we're human beings. We live and we operate in reality, but we don't perceive reality directly, right? Like I'm seeing you right now, but what's happening is there's light which is coming in. The photons are bouncing off you and entering my eyes. It's then this electromagnetic radiation.
It's the phenomenological.
Exactly. Yeah, it's being transduced into neural signals which allow me to sort of see you, right? But I still think this is reality. I operate like this is reality. I'm not a solipsist, right? I don't assume, okay, what I'm seeing is a hallucination, is not really real. Because to me, I trust, I make that axiom that
and you're not a
is
hard
real.
skeptic.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
But what happened with LSD and its mass introduction into American society? I'm talking well before the Summer of Love in 1967 with 100,000 people descending upon Haight-Ashbury Park in San Francisco,
right.
Many of whom ended up staying there for decades and becoming methamphetamine addicts when the LSD ran out in the early 1970s. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the individual phenomenon of you as a 16-year-old boy with some of your friends, a Grateful Dead concert just came by town and they dropped some stuff off. And you, and as a 16-year-old boy and all your friends, you go and take this new stuff called LSD. They say, hey, it's real wacky. And you take it, boom, you're now suddenly inducted into this entirely different experience that changes the reality that they were perceiving, which is the same as the one that I'm perceiving now, into something completely different.
You think that's bad?
I think, here's what I think. I think that it gives them an experience that their priests, their politicians, and their parents cannot explain or interpret or justify or attack, really. And it immediately, you flipped the operating zone for these people on a cognitive level, right? You have, previously they would have said, okay, well, something bad is happening in my reality, so maybe I should make a change, the error correction mechanism. Yeah. But now, something happens and they're like, well, it might not really be real. It might just be, oh, well, I know that I talked to space aliens when I was on LSD. So this guy firing me from my job, this is
more
nothing.
Like DMT than LSD, but okay.
Well, I mean, I've heard of both. Yeah. But you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, of course.
It completely deracinates the individual from this error correction mechanism, which is as natural and innate, I would say, as Chomsky's universal grammar. So it takes, it deroots you from, like previously you were standing on solid ground, now all of a sudden you're not. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Linda Gottfredson.
Yes.
So she's an intelligence researcher, and she found that basically, through her work, it has been hypothesized that what IQ does is it kind of acts as a proxy. Of course, it's a proxy for G, but it acts as a proxy for the overall interconnectedness and integrativeness of the human brain. In other words, its robustness, its health as a whole.
Right.
So I'm not denying, for instance, that you can have some people such as maybe Aldous Huxley and a few others who are obviously extremely intelligent, very high IQs, very healthy, safe brains, and could therefore do these things and maybe even benefit. I don't want to make a value judgment on that, right? Yeah. But I'm willing to grant it as a maybe. Maybe even benefit, maybe have some new experiences which did not disrupt the error correcting mechanism. But I would posit, and I'm very, very serious about this because I care a lot about the health of the people. As the Roman orator Cicero said, salus populi suprema lex esto. The health of the people is the supreme law. And as a Christian, and as a scientist, I firmly believe that. And so when you take someone who is like, forget the example of the 16-year-old boys, maybe like a vulnerable young girl, right? Who, do you know what the Grateful Dead actually did? They go from town to town to town in the US, spreading this mind. Yeah. Well, then and spreading this, what I would call in some ways a mind virus all around. And they would have a biochemist on board. And then after the shows, maybe they have a door guy or whatever, and they tell him, hey, go fetch us some girls, and they're already tripping. And so he goes around, and there are there's three sisters who are all like low teens, and they're out because this is like the early 1960s or the late 50s. This is latchkey kid culture. This is, if your kid says, hey, mom, I'm going out to a concert, you'll be like, yeah, sure, fine, go ahead, have fun. So you don't wonder where they are. There's no safeties there to keep them safe. They go out, they get picked up, taken back to the van. Here you go, drink this. Dose on LSD, then subjected to God knows what after that in the van. All of this stuff, especially if you're dealing with people with low IQs, is exceptionally destructive, because now you've given them this experience and these feelings, and you've treated them in certain ways, and now all of a sudden the error correction mechanism gets thrown into chaos. It's just completely disturbed. It's not able to operate properly. And you've seen this as well, and personally, I'm not shy to admit, in my own family, actually, people who suffer from psychosis due to marijuana addiction, right? And it breaks my heart to see and talk to them and realize, like, you are no longer able, like, whatever that fundamental rationality is, whether it's God-given or whether it's this, universal epistemic principle, as you might say, that's gone. And I don't even know if they can get it back. And all of that deeply troubles and disturbs me. So I would say the enemy that I see to, especially those who are vulnerable amongst us, cognitively vulnerable, let's say, and therefore, the rest of society, because we're all interlinked. The enemy is the thing that takes that principle that you and I care so much about, which is this, again, this fundamental rationality, whatever it is, and just throws that in the trash can. That's my enemy. That's what really concerns me.
The things that impede one's ability to find truth.
Yeah.
The things that tamper down on the possibility of corrective mechanisms emerging in a society or a culture.
That's my enemy.
Well, that's my enemy too.
Great to meet you.
Yeah, and I guess then the question becomes, what do we do to make sure that survives? Because if we're going to be honest with each other, things are not looking good now for the wholesale capture of the institutions, the capture of the media, the capture of journals, the capture of academia. And I would argue that almost everything that we're concerned about is downstream from not only academia, but colleges of teacher training, teacher education. So, the other thing that I was thinking about when you were speaking, I didn't say this because it's probably even too esoteric for this conversation, but pedagogical techniques. One of the papers I published that had, I think I wrote it in like a day or something. Wow. That had an amazing number of, I think it's my paper, the highest number of citations was something like...
Divine inspiration, maybe.
Well, I don't know. I'll tell you the story about it later, but it was, it's an uninteresting story, but something like pedagogy, the Socratic method, behaviorism, and constructivism. And I published another paper in a journal that went bust about the importance of having a corrective mechanism in pedagogies.
So the corrective mechanism article went bust.
No, the corrective mechanism, well, they're both about the same thing, but my argument is one of the reasons that the Socratic method is just so efficacious and so helpful and so useful is because it gives people, and this is one of the things I did with prison inmates, it gives them a corrective mechanism. It gives them a way to align their cognitions with reality. And one of the things that we've seen with the emergence of constructivism is, and whole Montessori schools, et cetera, are based upon this. And there's some aspects of constructivism I have no problem with, but it's the epistemological constructivism, which is an absolute toxin to everything that you and I are talking about here. It is the complete evisceration of the corrective mechanism. And so I would argue that it's getting in K through 12 and in colleges of education and even board meetings or public school meetings, a kind of street epistemology, which Reed and I do, are kind of preserving the means of error correction. Again, this is a very complicated conversation because you have social and cultural variables which impede the adoption, the wide-scale adoption of these mechanisms, because educators have to be concerned about certain things like and not just give lip service, like genuinely be concerned and about what is true. How do we help people find truth? And if their students come to conclusions they happen to disagree with, that's okay if they've thought through them, and really carefully analyze them. But the only way to do that is not only to have conversations with people with whom you disagree, but to have a robust epistemology embedded in the cognitive framework that manifests itself pedagogically through the classrooms. The problem is that we don't have people who value that. They want the classroom to be an ideology mill. That's exactly what my colleagues wanted. They want certain narratives, and I'm not a Christian, but it always bothered me that they had disdain for, letting people, like, I do think we should have debates. I'm a big fan, less debates, more of this. Was a conversation, me too, more of a conversation.
Yeah, me too.
I think the debates
have outlived their usefulness.
Yeah, I think so. But I am concerned about that. So when I think to the conversation, how do we solve this? Well, in one sense, the solution is fairly easy. And the older I get, I'm 58 now, the more I'm convinced that our problems come because of people not valuing the right thing. Like, we know the epistemological tools, we know the pedagogical tools, we know what we can do to help people learn to think through issues clearly and critically. Yeah. But the problem is that people don't value those tools because they don't value the outcomes. You know, in the 50s when behaviorism was hot and direct instruction was hot, that was a kind of, like, I often thought, you know, if you look at civilizations, Goebbels used to say, and the Nazis say, oh, you know, our building's going to be around for 1,000 years, and they embody the values of this Albert Speer. Yeah, that's right. Hitler's architect. But I think you can look at a society, the values of a society, and see, you know, it manifests in how they treat prison inmates, for example. It manifests in what pedagogies are used in K through 12 education. And right now we've created a generation of people, this is in the second generation of people, who simply don't value giving people the tools that lead them to truth. They value forwarding certain narratives and ideologies, and consequently those pedagogies aren't adopted. So what do you think about all that? There's a lot there, sorry.
I think that you actually have given, in this instance, maybe an even a significantly better answer to the question of, you know, why do civilizations die or why do societies die than we had earlier in this conversation. I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
It's because no matter what your bounded rationality is, as the environment changes, it's going to run into problems. So we talked about this extensively earlier with various examples. Now, you can be a black communist, and, you know, this is your ideology, this is your community, Black Panthers, whatever.
Yeah.
But if, like, you're being arrested for dealing drugs, right, as opposed to being arrested for, like, having meetings, maybe something's going wrong, right? Maybe you're doing something. Maybe you need to look to above the bounded rationality to, like, the corrective mechanism and say, okay, maybe we shouldn't sell drugs anymore, right? Which is something the Black Panthers had a lot of trouble doing. They couldn't do that, and not, you know, disparaging them now, maybe they've changed. So my point is, if you can live in whatever bounded rationality suits your environment, right?
Yeah.
But if you lack that superordinate principle, and then a problem comes, you're just going to smash your head against the wall trying the same thing over and over and over again, and nothing's going to change. So that's the answer. That's when a culture dies. That's when a civilization dies. It dies when they're unable to adapt to using the superordinate principle to a change in environmental circumstances. You know, if I am like a fisherman, and that's my bounded rationality, that's my identity, I'm a fisherman off the coast of Ireland somewhere, and then suddenly, you know, the oceans like dry up or whatever, become toxified, just any random thing. And then I'm like, okay, there's no more fish. I'm going to go out and look for fish. That's because I'm lacking the superordinate principle. I'm not correcting in context. So I'm just going to go bash my head against the wall, go looking for fish that aren't there. And then one day I'm just going to starve to death, right? This is how the spirit, society, culture, everything, this is how it dies. It dies when the superordinate rationality is completely abandoned, and you live in the bounded rationality of your fantasy, whether that fantasy be the culture, whether it be some particular religion, whether it be some particular drug experience. It could be any of those things. But if you do that, and then you don't have this corrective mechanism, you are just bashing your head into a wall until your brains show. Okay,
so two things. I was thinking of Searle's can't derive an off from is, and when you gave the fisherman example, Searle gives the example, he's, you know, John, whatever, John is a barber, John ought to cut hair. You know, Fred's a fisherman, or Sue's someone's a fisherman, and, you know, Sue ought to fish. But I'm thinking about the idea that I often think, okay, how do you help people value certain things? But it's not just certain things, it's the preserving the method of error correction. That would be the fundamental value. And for that, you know, you need free speech, you need freedom of the press. I would also argue by extension, you need freedom of assembly and other constitutive freedoms that contribute to that, contributory freedoms. The problem is, and I've been thinking about this in terms of your epistemology has to come first. So you have to make sure that you value the right things. Because if you value the wrong things and you try to institutionalize the wrong things, you're throwing society off in an arbitrary direction.
I see what you mean. But I would refer back to a disagreement you had with Jan Benz, who, as I mentioned,
he was on the show. Yeah,
a colleague of mine, a good friend. Like, what comes first, the superordinate principle or the bounded rationality? And I would say that, for example, with children, I mean, you remember the example he gave about, telling his 5-year-old, like, take this schmutz off your mouth.
Yes,
and
I
then
remember
goes to
that.
the couch.
Yeah.
I would say that we have to learn to crawl before we can learn to walk, so to speak. And that's, the progressive, that's an increase in functionality. And I would say the same is true also for these principles, like the fundamental principle, right? Which somehow is at the top. So we kind of reach up to it, we reach our hands out as infants. I would say when you learn to operate in your system first, then, and I think it's kind of localized, yeah. And I think it's akin to kind of cognitive maturation. You kind of learn, okay, like this is how things work in my system. And then you have a conversation with someone you disagree with, like you're advocating, and you say, okay, this is how things work in his system. You say, well, what do we both have in common? Well, we both adapt to error. We both adapt to mistakes. We correct. We self-correct. We have this thing of like driving our systems toward like truth in some sense, right? And what I would say is that this is something that used to emerge naturally in human beings, right? I would say so. But now it seems to be, as you mentioned,
from technology.
So your side is education, and I admire you for that. I truly do, for your commitments and service to education in terms of this mechanism. My side is very much more on technology, because I do think that technology is right now the principal threat to the fundamental principle. Because you can have, for example, we don't have to talk about like COVID vaccines or anything, but certainly we could talk about like the lockdowns, and it's like this is working. Shut up. This is working. Don't worry about it. The policies are working. Everything's working fine. It's like, clearly it's not working. So somewhere along the line, this principle must have been lost. We're no longer responding.
Look what they did to Jay Bhattacharya.
Yeah, precisely, which is a great example. So basically, it's like, when you're living inside a system, it's very difficult to, if you're inside a cardboard box, it's hard to describe accurately, the colors of the cardboard box on the outside from the inside, because you're in the dark and whatever. So when you're in a system, you don't really realize what that system is or looks like, but you can appreciate when the system loses something that it used to have, right? It's like the box used to be comfy, now it's not. So something has changed.
Only if you think that the system should have had it. Because
no, not necessarily.
Now we have systems. I'm thinking in education, to get back to yeah. I'm thinking now we have people in place, educational administrators, most of whom have EDDs. We did a wonderful thing with Lyle Asher on that. We have people in place that want to destabilize the whole system. They want to quote unquote disrupt and dismantle. That's their language. That's not my language. Yeah. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to not to blend too much stuff, but they're trying to queer things. They're trying to queer relationships, queer society. It doesn't mean gay. It just means that you want to destabilize the founding bedrock principles like heteronormativity, et cetera, that they think are somehow corrosive to the individual. And so the problem is that, to me, and I'm guessing to you to a very large extent, we would look at the systems and say, this is a problem, this is a problem. Like, you need ideological diversity, and that's Thomas Sowell's point in sociology department. So you need kind of a intellectual curiosity. You need a Popperian falsification of things. You need to change systems in certain ways, but the ways that you and I would agree upon, even though we disagree on, I would imagine, very profoundly on some conclusions, we agree that those methods and processes should be there because we agree on truth with a capital T.
I would say so, but I also, going back to the whole, evolution of human societies throughout history, I believe if you look at sort of what we're doing right now, I mean, you and me very specific. I mean, like, what are we doing? What role are we filling? I would say we do fulfill a role, and I would say the role is valuable. And I would say that the role is very much akin to the role played by, for example, going back for the third time in this conversation to it, but without shame, Mesopotamia, where you had the priest class sort of explaining the world to people, right? And that was a valuable thing. And I think that there are different norms and expectations that should that are in play de facto in society, depending on the role or niche you fill. I would not go up to a garbage man and try to lecture him on why I believe Ludwig Wittgenstein's epistemology is completely correct and valid, which I do, but I would not do that.
That's a great conversation. Yeah. The early Wittgenstein?
Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Yeah. That book made me a Christian, funnily enough, but that's a different.
Did it really? That was a profound book for me too.
Yeah, it's a different.
We should totally have that conversation at some point. That book profoundly affected me.
But so my point is, what I love in what you're saying is that I do believe that these methods and everything like it should be pursued for individuals within a certain set of roles and a certain set of those with a certain set of expectations, right? I think it becomes problematic when, again, this goes back to the point of homogeneity versus like diversity. We talked about Hungarian cultural diversity in terms of expressing forms. It's like, I want to live in a society that is diverse insofar as I do not want to live in a society where every single person is a university professor. I don't want to live in that kind of world. I like getting in a taxi and riffing with a taxi driver in my broken Hungarian about like, hey man, like, what's happening in the news and what do you think about the election? Like, I love that. I love going into a coffee shop and I love it when, the barista or the girl working there, she screws up my order a little bit. I'm like, that's fine. That little bit of randomness or whatever. So I think that these principles, absolutely, they should be in society, but there is a place to which they belong. And that place is academia. It is the priesthood class. I don't want to change the world. I don't want to change all of society. I want society to be able to change itself in response to the problems that it has. And I think that comes, the way that we do that is by making sure that our caste or our class, as well as the castes that listen to us, which would be sort of the merchant caste, for example, like the business, like the business leaders at social media companies, they do listen to us. They do listen to these podcasts. They do pay attention to our conversations. And then, also the political class as well. I would want them to be able to share these things. But I don't want to push in, education, in fundamental education, like pre-K or whatever you call it in America, like that all people have to learn this method. I'm not so convinced on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a different. What do you mean by this method? A dialectical method?
Yeah. Like the whole.
So I am convinced that it is, but
that's very interesting.
Yeah, we can have that. But one of the things that you were talking about, I was connecting it to something else in our conversation about sovereignty. Yeah. And so I gave a talk that Reed went to at MCC here, and it was like Reed, like 250, 300 high school students. A ton of hundreds of high school. I don't even know how many. I'm bad at estimating numbers, but anyway. And so among the things I talked about is I said, and I just, you said the priestly class, like, I don't want to be in this position. Like, I don't want to be the guy who goes up there who these are like children, dude. These are kids. Yeah. And, I said, like, you're fine just the way you are. Yeah. If you're gay, you're fine. If you don't need a surgery, you don't need to have your breasts removed. You don't need drugs.
We can agree on that.
Huh?
We can definitely agree on that.
Yeah, like, you're fine. I shouldn't have to be telling these kids, like, and this is, there is one country where this is coming from. We both know where that country is coming from, and we both know that it's a social contagion. I assume that you also believe it's a social. I think the evidence is other. We had Mia Hughes on the show. We've had Helen Joyce on the show. But it is, I don't, you said, I'd like to think that I'm doing useful work or work that lubricates the society in terms of enabling people to have better conversations or giving them tools or giving people. I am, I vacillate between long term. I'm very bullish on the United States. Short term, I'm deeply concerned. I'm deeply concerned about this election. Yeah. I'm deeply concerned about the divisiveness. You mentioned the national divorce. I'm deeply concerned about epistemological incommensurabilities, ways to solve problems, ways to look at, even ways to think about how the society should function. Yeah. And so I'm hoping as we end here, because I haven't eaten all day. Yeah. I'm hoping as we end, okay, two things. You have a magic wand. You wave the wand, and what changes about society can you make to help society? That's my first question. And the second question is, okay, you don't have a magic wand, but similar question, but what should we really be aiming for?
Okay, so can I ask you to, you're allowed to laugh, but can I ask you to not respond overtly to the first question, to the first answer in the interest of time? Of course. And I'm going to be completely honest with you, as you have been with me. Yeah. If I could wave a magic wand right now and do one thing that I do believe would save the world in a sense, I would wave the wand that causes everyone to accept Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior and join the Orthodox Church. That's what I would do. Now, you can laugh at that, say whatever.
No, I know, I'm not going to laugh or comment as I said, yes.
But in terms of without the magic wand, trickle-down economics is a phrase that has been kind of derided and mocked and stuff like this. But you know what is real? trickle down ideology, right? You talked about the trans issue earlier. Where did that come from? It came from up. The priests became bad priests. They began worshipping and making sacrifices to Moloch. And then from there, it goes up into policy, and then it trickles down like rain, like toxic rain, scattering over entire generations,
That's the educational
mutilating
system.
their bodies, everything like this. It's
Totally.
not just education, it's social media, it's everything, all these things. And so what I think we're doing right now, you and I right here, right now in this room, is we are fighting that with trickle-down positivity of our own, trickle-down truth, let's call it. Trickle-down truth that, we're broadcasting this truth out.
Let me add to that. Trickle-down agreement on the ways to increase the likelihood that you'll be less wrong.
I can go with that.
Okay.
I can go with that. And so I think that this is an instance of fight fire with fire, so to speak. And then you might say, okay, well, Wael, Antonio, it's like, they're already fighting with fire, and fire meets fire, nothing happens. The problem is that reality kicks you in the ass, right? All of those drug addicts from Haight-Ashbury Park, where I've studied a lot, I've read the case reports from the local clinics and stuff. It hit them in the ass real hard. And eventually there comes to a point where you reach rock bottom, and then you have to go and beg for forgiveness, not just to God, but to your society and to those that you've hurt, and also from yourself.
Yeah, that's one of the pillars of AA, right?
Yeah. And my hope is that what we're doing right here, right now, in terms of this trickle-down, truth-finding mechanisms, truth, whatever we would call it.
Rules of engagement as well. We agree on the rules. I'm
Yes.
not going to get up and strangle you right now.
I very much appreciate that. So my hope is that what we're doing will get to them first,
Right.
before they hit rock bottom.
Right.
Because if society hits rock bottom before truth or truth-finding mechanisms or agreement can reach them, I believe that they are as done, as dead, and doomed to what is essentially hell on earth. So those would be my last remarks.
Thank you. Wael, where can people find you?
So they can find me on Twitter, my ex/coevolutionist. They can find me on Instagram /democide. I'm currently setting up a link tree where you can see all my work, and I'll be starting a Substack soon with some of my older writings and some of my new ones. So keep an eye out for that.
All right. Thank you very much. And for those in my audience who like this conversation, keep watching. And I recommend that you watch the videos coming next. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was a pleasure.